I was watching this video from the Electric Underground. I think it was the Shmups Are Not a Simple Genre one, and at some point in the video he scrolled through some of his code for the shmup he was making, which also is in GameMaker like mine. So I paused the video and took a look at his code, and the poor guy was copying out each individual bullet and explosion, and he had like a million timers going and stuff like that. So in this video I'm just going to explain my method for programming more complicated bullet patterns with just a few lines of code. Before I start though, I will warn you that I'm not really a programmer. I usually just do what I need to do to get the game to run, and that's about it. So yes, I am aware that my syntax is horrendous and that my code isn't exactly perfect, but I still think that what I had to say might make your life a lot easier, so bear with me. So, most importantly, every enemy has a shoot variable that acts as the timer that triggers all the bullet patterns, starting at 0 and ticking up by 1 at every frame. One thing I also noticed in Mark's code is that he would type out something like shot timer 1 equals shot timer 1 plus 1, which works, but you'll save yourself a lot of hassle by just typing out shot timer plus plus, which does the same thing. Anyway, say I just want to make a simple line of bullets. First, I reference the shoot variable to set when the pattern will fire. Here I start with if shoot is greater than or equal to 60 and shoot is less than 120. Neometric runs at 60 frames per second, and in GameMaker, logic frames are the same as rendering frames, so this pattern will fire starting after 1 second has passed and continue to fire for 1 second. Then I use the mod function to establish the rate at which the pattern will fire while it's active. You can type out the word mod or just use a %sign, and basically what this function does is the same as division, except it returns the remainder after dividing instead of the quotient. This means you can check for when a value is evenly divisible by a number by checking if the remainder is equal to 0. For example, I use if shoot mod 4 equals 0 as one of the conditions for the pattern to fire. This basically means that the pattern will only fire if the shoot variable is divisible by 4. So, since the pattern starts when shoot equals 60, it will fire on the first frame, since 60 is divisible by 4, but will not fire for the next 3 frames, as 61, 62, and 63 are all not divisible by 4. But it will fire again on the next frame because 64 is divisible by 4. All that is to say that this condition will make the pattern fire every 4 frames. So basically, this line of code determines when the pattern starts, when the pattern ends, and the rate at which the pattern fires. I use this method for every bullet pattern in the game just by changing these numbers around. As for the pattern itself, I of course use the instance create function, which not only creates a new instance, but also returns the ID of the instance that was just created. This means that if you type with instance create, you can execute code within the newly created instance. In this case, that means stuff like setting the bullet's direction, speed, and sprite. I have a lot of different variables set up that I can change about a bullet when it's created, including stuff like acceleration and rotation, but if I don't specify something here, then it will just have the default setting. Depending on the situation, you may have to instead create a variable to store the new bullet's ID. You can do something like inst equals instance create, which sets inst to be the ID of the bullet, and then you can use inst dot to change the bullet's variables. This is only necessary if you need to reference a variable from the parent object, like if I wanted the bullet's direction to be the same as the enemy's direction, for example. This is because using with executes the code within the new bullet, while using inst.something executes the code within the parent object. That isn't necessary in this example though, so I'll just go with. As you can see, these few lines of code make exactly what I was going for, which is just a simple line of bullets. If I didn't use the mod function, then I would have to go in and type out every bullet and specify their variables each time I wanted to shoot one, which would take at least 10 times the code if I typed it all out. Now let's talk about an easy way to make waves of bullets. It starts out the same as before, establishing when the pattern starts, ends, and the rate at which it fires. This time it will start at 180, end at 240, and fire every 20 frames. Next, since I'll be creating several similar but slightly different bullets all at once, I'll use a temporary variable I to keep track of the difference in direction of each of the bullets. Then I use a while loop to create several bullets on the same frame. Basically, I set I to be the angle of the first bullet, and use the value of the while function to be the angle of the last bullet. Then, in the while loop, I create a bullet. This time I create a bullet and store its ID onto the inst variable, since I will need to reference I from the parent object when setting its direction. For this example, I set the bullet's direction to be 270, which is directly down, plus whatever I is. After that, I increase I by 10 before the function loops. This means that the first bullet will have an angle of 270 minus 40, which is 230, but the next bullet will have an angle of 270 minus 30, which is 240. Basically, the spacing between bullets is determined by the amount that I is increased by every loop. Eventually, I will exceed 40, and the while loop will end. You could use a for loop instead, but I prefer while in cases where I increments by more than 1 each iteration. As you can see, this code fires bullets from the angles of 230 to 310 with a bullet every 10 degrees, making 9 bullets in this case. The number of bullets depends on the spacing and range of the wave. Again, i's initial value affects the starting angle, the condition for the while loop affects the ending angle, and the amount that I increases by every loop determines the bullet spacing. Another super helpful thing to do is to create scripts for common bullet patterns. This script, for example, lets me simply plug in arguments for the X and Y position, bullet speed, and spacing, and creates a wave of aimed bullets based on the input. All the patterns you're seeing now all actually use this exact same script, but just in different ways. Now that we've made a couple of patterns, we can simply set shoot back to 0 when it reaches a certain threshold, which will make these couple of patterns repeat forever. Now, let's make a more complicated pattern using this method. I'm going to make the next attack trigger during a second phase for this enemy, which is super simple. I have the phase variable start at 0 and make all the patterns I made so far only trigger while phase is 0. I also have this init HP variable, which saves the initial value of the enemy's HP. This line checks to see if the enemy's current HP is less than half of its initial HP, and if so, it increases the phase by 1 and resets shoot back to 0. Now I'll have the pattern I'm about to make only trigger while phase is equal to 1, which will only happen when the enemy's HP is below half. I sometimes like to base my patterns off of existing ones from good shmups, so for the sake of example, let's use this attack from DOJ's final boss as a template. I'll make 4 rotating streams of bullets going either direction, represented by the variables dir and dir2. I have them increasing at different rates to make the pattern a little bit more complicated to dodge. First, let's have a bullet fired after 60 frames have passed every 4 frames. Then, since I'll be referencing the enemy's variables to determine the bullet's direction, I'll use inst dot to set the bullet's variables. Now, still under the same if statement, I'll make another bullet fire the same way, the only difference being that I subtract 180 from the bullet's direction, so it will fire the opposite of the first one. This makes 2 streams of bullets rotating counterclockwise around the enemy. Next, let's make a clockwise version of everything we just did. This one will fire after 120 frames have passed instead, but still fire every 4 frames. Then, everything is the same as before, except I use dir2 to set the bullet's direction, which again is increasing at a slightly different rate than dir. I also make dir2 negative, which will make the stream rotate the opposite way. Then, for the second bullet, I do the exact same thing, except subtract 180 to make it fire opposite from the first. Now we have 2 streams going counterclockwise, and then after a delay, 2 clockwise streams come in as well. Finally, let's make a group of bullets aimed at the player. After 180 frames have passed, every 60 frames, a group of 10 bullets will be fired. Inside this while loop, I is reduced by 1 each cycle, and each cycle that I is greater than 0, a bullet is made. The bullet's direction is based off the player's position, but I made it slightly random to discourage micrododging the pattern. The bullet's speed will also be slightly random for the same reason. Now, after all the streams of bullets have activated, the enemy will begin to fire these random aimed waves at the player to force him to move. So that's pretty much the process I go through for making every pattern in the game. It might not be the most perfect or correct way to program it, but it still works quite well, and I much prefer using math to make my patterns rather than typing out each bullet myself. Again, I'm not much of a programmer, so my code's definitely not perfect, but hopefully you found this helpful if you're working on a shmup of your own, or at least you found it entertaining. Either way, thanks for watching.